Fans of AuthentiKit, welcome back. Did you know that in a few days' time it will be 90 years to the day that the first Spitfire, K5054, first took to the air? And this seemed a fitting deadline to close an important chapter of our Spitfire development work, the work that AuthentiKit has had underway now for over 5 years. So, in a few days' time, I'm going to be releasing the Spitfire Magneto, and this will occupy the final available input slot in our Universal Hub H7. And to support this release, I'm going to be introducing an important new component to the AuthentiKit ecosystem. Not only will it facilitate the mapping of this Magneto to your SIM, but it will hugely simplify the usability of the AuthentiKit control set by providing a ready-to-fly configuration for the entire Spitfire. And this in turn will clear the way for all the other great stuff that's still to come. So, before I explain how this new part of our ecosystem fits in, let's just take stock of where we are in our Spitfire development. Here's our Universal Hub, and we started with the H1 flight stick. We added the throttle in H2, trim wheels H3 and H4, flaps H5, and gears H6. We've got our gun sight in H8, and we've decided to reserve H9 and HX for custom configurations. So that leaves H7, and the Magneto will be our official control for H7, and it will close Chapter 1 of our story. But this is only Chapter 1, and I know you're all keen to get your hands on the various controls you've seen me develop for the BBMF, like the fuel cock, the fuel pump, the primer, and so on. And that means we'll need an additional Universal Hub. So I've decided to designate this first hub the primary flight and engine controls, and I've designed this sticker. If you like it, I've uploaded the design to one of those on-demand printing sites where you can order a very attractive copy in hard-wearing vinyl. There's a link in the description. Now, if you're wondering what the next Universal Hub will be, I've given it a working title, Fuel, Ignition and Systems, but that's for later. What we need to talk about now is this mystery new component. Well, it's essentially a companion software application along the lines of the AuthentiKit tuning app, but with a lot more to it. First, it does need to support controls such as the new Magneto. Now with the Magneto, I made the design decision to minimize the internal moving parts, so it was a very easy to assemble item, and it should last a very long time. So instead of generating a click or a pulse when the position changes, it's like a normal switch. It's either on or it's off. Now this means that with just 2 input wires we can detect 4 different actions, going from off to on to off, and that's on number 1 Magneto, and then off to on to off on 2 Magneto. So we need a companion app that convert 2 switches to 4 actions. Now so far I've introduced to you 2 different apps for this job. The first is our original AuthentiKit tuning app. If you're not familiar with this, you can get it from the download site, and the link is in the description. It's free and it's super focused on the needs of AuthentiKit controls, but it's dependent on a volunteer who has limited time. The second is Spad.next. Very powerful, it's got a nice user interface, and it can do just about anything we need. In fact, it does a lot more than we need, and it does cost money. Not a huge amount, but in the spirit of the AuthentiKit freeware community, I just felt it wasn't right that we should be dependent on a payware application. And that brings us to the new official AuthentiKit companion app, MobiFlight. So here's a quick rundown on why I've switched to MobiFlight as our official app. First, it's free. It's developed by a great guy called Sebastian, who's been super supportive of the AuthentiKit project. He specifically developed code to talk to our Universal Hub boards, so it recognizes boards called AuthentiKit or the native BU 0836A. He's also been very helpful as I've got up to speed with how MobiFlight works, and that's important for the longer term. I also like the way you can easily share MFProj files, which will hold either individual control configurations or entire aircraft configurations. And finally, this was a clincher for me. You don't need to pair it with VJoy. It will talk direct to your SIM. Now unfortunately the interface to DCS won't be out until later this year, so for now you will need still the VJoy version with DCS. However, it's already well established with MSFS. For IL2 we don't have a date yet for a direct version, so for you guys it's still VJoy. Now, let me show you where to get MobiFlight and how to install it so it supports AuthentiKit. Get it from here, the MobiFlight download page. There's no need to create a login if you don't want to. So install it, launch it, and then there's one setting you first need to change in order to support AuthentiKit. And here it is, under Extras, Settings, and you need to select Beta. Then close MobiFlight and restart, and you'll get an update. Okay, so now we're in MobiFlight, and you can see that I've got Spitfire MSFS encoder trim v0.11 as my current project, which I can run by clicking this green arrow. I can set it to auto run this configuration, though I haven't done that. And I can also load different configurations. You can see here I can load them as mfproj files from my desktop, and by clicking on any, I can make it my current project. You can mouse over a non-current project and click the bin icon to remove it from the projects panel. It won't delete the file, it'll just take it from the panel. So we're kind of beginning a journey today, and I don't have all the configurations for every situation ready. And even this MSFS config doesn't cover all the H1 to H8 inputs, which is why it isn't v1.0. What I will be releasing is this config, the encoder trim v0.11. So let me explain that and recap on what's coming down the line. So we'll be starting with MSFS, and I'll tell you where we are and where we soon will be. Please use this version I'm sharing today, give feedback in Discord or here on YouTube. When I do release v1.0 in a few weeks, there will actually be two separate configurations. There's the MSFS encoder trim v1.0 and the MSFS raw trim v1.0. And this is because some of you run your elevator trim in encoder mode and some in raw mode. Let me just recap what I mean by that. Right now, if I launch the utility app buencoder.exe, available from our download site, links in the description, you can see that pins 9 and 10 and 11 and 12 are set to 1:4 ratio. That means that both the inputs for the rudder trim, which is 9 and 10, and the elevator trim, 11 and 12, are set to encoder mode. So when we rotate the rudder or elevator trim, it generates a pulse for every click, which you don't feel, of course, because of the friction pad. So you can get 24 clicks per revolution, giving you a resolution of 1 click every 15 degrees. Now that's pretty fine for the rudder, but sometimes we want more resolution for the elevator trim. By setting 11 and 12 to off, we send a more complex stream of data to the PC, which is processed by MobiFlight, which effectively doubles the resolution to 48 steps per revolution, or a step every 7.5 degrees, which is a very nice improvement. Right now, the configuration I'm releasing today assumes encoder mode. The next item to discuss is axes, but let's do this in MobiFlight. We'll click this arrow to open the current project. You can see we have a tab for every input port, H1 to H8. However, H1, H2 and H8 are empty. These are primarily axes-based inputs, and at the moment Sebastian's interface to our BU board can get a bit confused by axes, so that's the main reason this isn't v1.0. Having said that, you may not even want to do axes via MobiFlight, as you won't have access to the sensitivity and dead zone tweaking that you get to do in the simulator. But if you did use MobiFlight for the axes, then everything would be handled in MobiFlight, and basically you'd have a completely blank set of control mappings in MSFS, which is kind of tidy. So let me step you through these other tabs. The most interesting one is the H3, H4 tab, and here I've made something rather special for you. Right now, if you watch the animation in the Flying Iron Spitfire Mark 9, you'll see that full lock to full lock on the rudder is 1 rotation, 360 degrees, and for the elevator trim, full lock to full lock is 4 full rotations of 1440 degrees. By default, this configuration I'm releasing today synchronizes your AuthentiKit trim wheels to this animation. However, when we tested the trim wheels on the RAF Spitfire Mark 9, we found it was more like 1.5 revolutions between full lock on the rudder. I actually calculated 635 degrees, and for the elevator trim, only 2 full turns between full lock down and full lock up. So, I've given you the option. You can choose whichever you prefer. Make sure MobiFlight's stopped. Then, if you'd like the BBMF accurate rudder trim, disable this option and enable this one. Independently of that, if you want the BBMF accurate elevator trim, disable this option and enable this. Then restart and that's it. And you can hit save if you want it remembered like that for next time. Now, there's yet another very cool feature in this trim configuration, and it's why I'm so excited about having this direct-to-sim functionality. If you've been using the AuthentiKit tuning app to synchronize trim wheel movement, you'll know that as soon as you touch the elevator trim, the simulator trim does an unexpected flick of rotation. This is because the Spitfire is usually set trim down in the sim for takeoff, but the tuning app doesn't know what the default configuration is, so it starts trim neutral. So the first touch of your trim wheel jumps the sim version of the trim to neutral. My MobiFlight configuration detects the sim being initialized and fetches the current trim position from MSFS and completely resolves that issue. We've also got flaps and gear, and they're pretty simple in comparison, and then the all-important magneto, which is all set for my release of the magneto next week. So that's the situation with MSFS v1.0, which will include axes, and there'll be an encoder version and a raw version. Now the great news about DCS is that Sebastian is developing an equivalent interface to DCS, at which point MobiFlight will handle everything for you. But in the meantime, we will release 2 more MobiFlight configurations for DCS users, and in fact this will also be the option for IL2. It's Spitfire VJoy encoder trim v1.0 and Spitfire VJoy raw trim v1.0. Now in practice I expect DCS and IL2 folk to map as much as possible direct from the controller, and the main thing you'll need MobiFlight for is trim synchronization and the magneto. So that's where we are, folks. MobiFlight promises to be a great partner for AuthentiKit, but we're at the start of our journey, so make sure you're subscribed and I'll keep you updated as we get more and more functionality ready to fly.